The crater inside a crater. Nobody in Australia talks about. Roughly 275 kilometres west of Melbourne, along the coastal plains of southwest Victoria, there is a volcano that does something almost no other crater in the country does. Inside its outer wall sits a second, separate set of craters entirely, complete with their own islands, their own cones, and their own eruption history layered directly on top of the first. Geologists have a specific term for a structure like this. They call it a nested maar, and this one happens to be the largest of its kind anywhere in the state. Most people driving past have no idea any of this is here at all. The site is called Tower Hill, sitting around 15 kilometres northwest of Warrnambool, and from a distance it looks like an unusually large, oddly shaped hill rising out of otherwise flat coastal farmland. Step inside the crater itself and the scale becomes considerably harder to ignore. The outer rim stretches roughly 3 kilometres across, with walls dropping as much as 90 metres down to the crater floor below. Inside that outer basin sits a lake, and rising directly out of that lake are a series of smaller volcanic islands, cone-shaped hills formed by an entirely separate wave of eruptions that occurred after the original crater had already filled with water. That is the part that makes Tower Hill genuinely unusual, even among Australia's substantial list of volcanic sites. This was not one clean, single explosion followed by a slow, quiet fill. It was a violent eruption, a period of relative calm, long enough for water to gather, and then a second, distinct series of explosions breaking through the floor of the crater that had already formed, pushing new cones and islands directly up through the existing lake. Layer stacked on layer, each one leaving its own physical mark, all contained within the boundary of a single original crater wall. Recent argon dating places the primary eruption at approximately 36,800 years ago, making Tower Hill roughly contemporaneous with the eruptions that formed the Budge Bim landscape further west, part of the same broader volcanic period, reshaping this stretch of Victoria's coastline. It sits at the western end of an entire chain of similar volcanoes, stretching in a rough line from Colac through to Port Fairy, roughly 30 separate eruption points scattered across what geologists call the Newer Volcanics Province, a region considered geologically young by Australian standards, meaning the ground beneath much of southwest Victoria is, relatively speaking, still settling from activity that occurred well within the time frame modern humans were already present on this continent. The land itself carries evidence of exactly how long that presence has lasted. Archaeologists working at Tower Hill have identified ancient kitchen middens, layered deposits of shell, bone, and discarded material left behind by generations of use at the same campsites, some containing the bones of Tasmanian devils, dated to around 5,000 years old. That detail matters beyond simple curiosity. Tasmanian devils are assumed by most people today to exist only on the island that carries their name, having vanished from the Australian mainland long ago. Finding their remains at a mainland site only 5,000 years old pushes that assumed extinction date on the mainland considerably later than many people would expect. Evidence preserved almost by accident inside the everyday rubbish of people who had been living, eating, and returning to this exact volcanic landscape for a very long time. Before we go further, my ebook, The Timeline Lie, covers 15 more sites like this across the country, link below. To the Darwood Wurrung people, the traditional custodians of this land, the volcano carries the name Koroit, a name that continues today in the nearby town of Koroit, sitting on the northern rim of the crater itself. That continued naming is not incidental. It reflects a relationship with this landscape that long predates any European survey, mapping, or eventual attempt at conservation. A connection to this exact volcanic ground stretching back through the same span of time the Middens themselves quietly document. European settlement, once it arrived, treated the site with considerably less care. Tower Hill was progressively cleared through the 1800s, used as pasture for grazing stock, cropped for farming, quarried directly for stone, and at different points even used as an informal venue for motorcycle racing. By the mid-19th century, the dense native vegetation that had defined the crater for tens of thousands of years had been almost entirely stripped away, leaving behind a landscape that one visitor, returning years after an earlier trip, described as barely recognisable. With nearly every mature tree on the crater's islands gone except for a scattered handful. Make sure you are subscribed, because what happened next at Tower Hill became one of the more remarkable restoration stories in Australian conservation history. In 1855, a local landholder named James Dawson, concerned about how rapidly the site was being altered, commissioned the artist Eugene von Gerard to paint the crater exactly as it appeared at the time. A detailed, accurate landscape capturing the vegetation, the islands, and the lake before further clearing could take place. For over a century, that painting existed largely as a historical curiosity, a striking record of a landscape that no longer matched what stood on the ground. Then, in 1966, a descendant of Dawson's family donated the painting to the state's wildlife authorities, and it became something considerably more useful than a piece of colonial art hanging on a wall. It became a blueprint. Using von Gerard's painting as a direct visual reference, conservationists began the long process of restoring Tower Hill to something resembling its original state, planting native vegetation species by species, informed by exactly what the crater had looked like more than a century earlier. Over the following decades, more than 300,000 native trees were planted across the site, gradually rebuilding an ecosystem that had been almost entirely stripped away within a single generation of European settlement. Wildlife returned along with the vegetation. Koalas, kangaroos, emus, echidnas, and colonies of water birds, including magpie geese, now move freely through a landscape that, only a few generations earlier, had been reduced to bare paddock and quarried rock. Tower Hill holds another distinction that rarely gets mentioned alongside its geology. In 1892, it was declared Victoria's first national park, decades before most Australians had any real concept of formally protected natural land. That early recognition did not prevent the clearing that had already taken place, but it eventually provided the legal and administrative foundation that allowed the later restoration project to actually happen. Protected ground on which a landscape nearly lost to farming and quarrying could be deliberately, carefully rebuilt. Today, a visitor centre designed by influential Melbourne architect Robin Boyd, sits within the reserve. Its shape deliberately built to echo the volcanic cones scattered throughout the crater itself, completed around 1970 as the restoration effort was already well underway. Parks Victoria has managed the site since 1997, continuing a conservation program that, by any reasonable measure, ranks among the most complete landscape recovery efforts undertaken anywhere in the country. A location stripped down to almost nothing and rebuilt tree by tree from a single painting. What makes Tower Hill worth sitting with, beyond the geology and beyond the restoration story individually, is how directly those two threads run together. This is a crater within a crater, a genuinely rare nested maar structure holding evidence of overlapping eruptions separated by enough time for a lake to form in between. It is also a landscape that was almost entirely erased within a matter of decades, saved largely by chance, through one landholder's decision to commission a painting he had no way of knowing would eventually function as a restoration map more than a century later. Strip away either thread, and the story loses most of what makes it strange. Together, they describe a place that has now been shaped twice, once by fire and water tens of thousands of years ago, and once again by people working backward from a single canvas, trying to put back what an earlier generation had almost entirely taken away. Drive past Tower Hill today along the coastal road between Warrnambool and Port Fairy, and from the highway it still reads as little more than an unusually large hill, easy enough to pass without a second thought. Climb down into the crater itself, and that impression falls apart almost immediately. A volcano holding a second volcano inside it, a lake full of islands that are themselves eruption points, and a forest that, within living memory, was not there at all, replanted deliberately from a colonial era painting most Australians have never heard of, sitting inside a national park most Australians have never visited. At the base of a mainland volcano, most Australians did not know still had a story left to tell. The eruption sequence itself is worth sitting with a little longer, because the physical process that shaped Tower Hill was considerably more violent than the calm lake and quiet islands you see today would suggest. Maar volcanoes like this one form through what geologists call phreatomagmatic eruptions, occurring when rising magma makes direct contact with groundwater sitting in the surrounding rock. The result is not a slow lava flow, but something closer to a series of steam-driven explosions, magma instantly flashing groundwater into vapour, blasting rock, ash and debris outward with tremendous force. That initial explosive phase carved out Tower Hill's outer basin, ejecting pyroclastic material across a wide area and leaving behind the deep, steep-walled crater that still defines the site's outer boundary today. What happened next is where Tower Hill separates itself from most other maar volcanoes in the region. Rather than settling permanently into a single quiet lake, the site experienced renewed magma activity within the same vent system, breaking back up through the floor of the crater that had already begun to fill with water. These secondary eruptions built the scoria cones now standing as islands, smaller, steeper volcanic structures formed from accumulated fragments of cooled lava and ash, each one representing its own distinct eruptive event layered directly on top of the first. Researchers studying the site have used this layered sequence, comparing sediment deposits found within different sections of the crater to help reconstruct the rough order in which these later eruptions occurred, even without being able to pin down an exact date for every individual phase. That complexity is part of why Tower Hill continues to draw genuine scientific interest well beyond its role as a conservation success story. Few volcanic sites anywhere in Victoria preserve this particular combination of features in one place: an outer explosion crater, an internal lake, and a distinct secondary generation of scoria cone islands, all confirmed to have formed through overlapping but separate eruptive events. For geologists studying how Maar volcanoes evolve over time, Tower Hill functions as something close to a natural laboratory, a single, accessible site where the full, layered sequence of a nested eruption can be studied directly on the ground, rather than reconstructed purely from theory. It is that same combination of scientific rarity and near total human erasure that makes the site's recovery feel less like an isolated conservation project and more like a genuine second chance the landscape was never guaranteed to get. Most cleared ecosystems in Australia's colonial history were never returned to anything resembling their original state, simply absorbed permanently into farmland or replaced with introduced species better suited to agriculture than restoration. Tower Hill only avoided that fate because one landholder happened to commission a painting, and because that painting happened to survive intact in private hands for over a century before finally reaching the people equipped to use it properly. Remove either of those two coincidences from the story, and there is no clear reason to believe Tower Hill would look anything like it does today.